the great Egyptian city of Alexandria in 31 BC. The hub of the kingdom has always been the royal palace, but not anymore. Cleopatra, queen of this ancient kingdom, has only minutes to live. She has already lost all power over her 3,000-year-old empire, and now a snake will bring the story to an end. Cleopatra had ambitious goals: to bring an empire that was older than any other back into full bloom, to resurrect its splendid past. Dreams that would end in death and destruction. Ancient Egypt. It is still one of the most mysterious empires in the history of the world. The first light was shed on it 200 years ago, when its hieroglyphic writing was deciphered. Then came the discovery of the tombs of the pharaohs. Ancient historians knew that Egypt is a gift of the River Nile. Before draining into the sea through a vast delta, the Nile runs through 2,000 kilometers of desert. If not for the Nile, Egypt would be no more than a sea of hot sand. The Nile's waters nurtured Egypt's cities, early testimony to a great civilization. The Mediterranean in the north, the Great Desert in the west, and the Red Sea in the east secured Egypt against all enemies for thousands of years. The Nile brought fertility. Thousands of years of peace brought prosperity and the construction of monumental buildings. There was the Temple of Isis at Philae, the mortuary temple of Queen Hatshepsut with its sandstone statues 3,500 years old, or the 20-meter columns at Karnak that once supported the mighty temple of Amun. Even ancient visitors were awestruck by Egypt's grandeur. The Greek historian Herodotus was amazed by what he found.
Look at Herodotus, the father of history. When he came to Egypt for the first time in the middle of the 5th century BC, he looked at those people. He could not believe. He could not believe that this civilization existed, because he found that the Egyptian created science and technology more than anyone in the world.
So much of the culture that developed on our blue planet originated in Egypt, the cradle of our civilization. And the place where it all started can be pinpointed: Abydos, the first sacred shrine of the pharaohs. The entrance to one of the oldest royal tombs. Here, scientists from the German Archaeological Institute are searching for the earliest traces of the empire. This stone tablet illustrates the brutal methods used by Narmer, the first pharaoh, in uniting Egypt's provinces. The upraised club symbolizes his policy. Whoever resisted died. Narmer's empire was founded on blood and tears. The dig is covered with potsherds and clay bricks, remnants of a culture that began to develop here more than 5,000 years ago. Every square centimeter of earth is thoroughly examined. Valuable objects are still found in Egypt almost every day. But on this site, Professor Dreher is not looking for gold or precious stones. He is searching for early knowledge of the ancient Egyptians.
An dieser Stelle haben wir die ältesten Schriftzeugnisse Ägyptens, die man phonetisch lesen kann, in einem Königsgrab gefunden, das etwa 3200 vor Christus zu datieren ist. Ich glaube, dass hier der Name eines Königs genannt ist, als Herkunftsvermerk von einem Wirtschaftsgut und dass daher dieses Grab einem König namens Skorpion zuzuweisen ist. Diese Täfelchen, auf denen ein Storch und ein Stuhl zu sehen ist, sind eindeutig als phonetische Schrift zu identifizieren durch Vergleiche mit späteren Hieroglyphen, von denen man weiß, der Storch hat den Lautwert Ba, der Stuhl den Lautwert Set, zusammen Ba-Set, und das ergibt den Namen einer Stadt im Delta, Basta.
The name of King Scorpion on the clay vase may be the first written word in human history. Soon, hundreds of scribes perfected a system of writing, a groundbreaking cultural achievement that eclipsed anything mankind had so far devised.
The development of writing in ancient Egypt made possible the development of Egyptian civilization in its most complex forms. Without writing, there could have been no record keeping. The advent of writing is absolutely essential to the development of the state as we know it. And that was true both in ancient Egypt and in virtually every other ancient culture that grew into the complex cultural form we call civilization.
The invention of writing also had another use, one that helps us today. The ancient Egyptians wrote down everything they considered important. So we know their way of life and their way of death. Their great achievements and even how ordinary people lived in ancient Egypt. It was almost the same way of life as in rural areas today. Tilled with simple tools and warmed by the ever-present sun, the fertile soil is highly productive. As long as no unusual disasters such as locusts, droughts or sandstorms lay waste to everything, the harvest is rich and no one goes hungry. An unending cycle of good fortune.
The continuity, I think, is a function of the never-changing landscape. The Nile that flooded every year, the sun that rose and set every day, the moon that rose and set every month, all provided the same kind of day after day after day continuity. The basic fabric of ancient Egypt did remain pretty much the same from Dynasty 1 until Dynasty 30. The structure of Egyptian religion was generally the same. The art and architecture was generally the same. The kind of literature that we have, the agricultural practices, all point to a degree of continuity.
The construction of the pyramids was the first high point of the rule of the pharaohs. The pyramids are still a puzzle even today. How did the Egyptians create the seventh wonder of the world from millions of stone blocks? Did the builders use a central ramp? Unlikely, since the ramp would have been larger than the actual pyramid. A spiral ramp would only make sense if it was integrated into the building itself. With this kind of ramp, however, it would have been almost impossible to measure and align the edges. The most likely scenario? Multiple steep ramps, up to 50 meters high, providing access to 70% of the pyramid's volume. Once past 50 meters, a single ramp would have been enough. The pyramids are like symbols for the ancient Egyptian concept of the state. Pharaoh Cheops, the god king, sat at the top of the social pyramid. He and his successors linked the people with the gods and brought order out of chaos. That order underwrote the peaceful development of the Egyptian empire over many centuries.
Die Pharaonen werden gerne als Gottkönige bezeichnet. In dieser Rolle des Königs sehen die alten Ägypter auch die Legitimation und den Anlass, diese gewaltigen Bauleistungen für die Pyramiden zu vollbringen.
Through manual labor, millions of people contributed to the greater glory of the God King. For his part, he guaranteed them a stable society, a social contract that was successful for hundreds of years.
Then the pyramid or the tomb became the national project of the whole nation. Then everyone participated in building this tomb. And therefore it's continued from a pharaoh to a pharaoh, from a dynasty to a dynasty. That system made this civilization for 3,000 years. And this is why building the pyramids or building tombs for the pharaohs built Egypt.
The people of ancient Egypt really did pull together. We know today that building the pyramids was anything but forced labor for slaves. The warm climate and the fertile mud of the Nile created a surplus in agricultural production. Nobody suffered hardship by working temporarily for the common cause. Thus, the pyramids of Giza, the seventh wonder of the ancient world, were much more than a giant architectural achievement. The pyramids represented the political concept on which the stability of this ancient empire relied.
And the pyramid therefore became a very potent symbol of the close relationship between gods and Egyptian human beings. By building these structures, we were ensuring that the line of communication between man and gods remained unbroken and indeed could be enhanced.
Gigantic building works punctuate the entire 3,000-year history of ancient Egypt. Buildings and their rulers. Queen Hatshepsut and her co-regent Thutmose erected these giant temples for the dead, architecture for rulers. Like the great hypostyle hall at Karnak, built 3,500 years ago by Queen Ti and Pharaoh Amenhotep. The monument as an eternal claim to power. Like their buildings, the names of the pharaohs are still remembered to this day. Akhenaten, the one chosen by the sun, and Nefertiti, beauty, arriving. The world-famous temple of Ramses II, the pharaoh who ruled for 64 years, was cut from the living rock. The last queen of Egypt ruled for only 15 years. She chose this temple in Dendera as the monument to immortalize her name, Cleopatra. Standing at the end of those 3,000 years of Egyptian history, she tried everything to save the empire. Legend has made Cleopatra a seductive femme fatale. In fact, she was rather short. Not only that, but her image on coins, though intended to glorify her as queen, does not suggest a great beauty. So what was it about Cleopatra that fascinated the mightiest men of her age? By the last century before Christ, Egypt, a land of milk and honey for more than 3,000 years, had long since lost its position as a great power. Another people now dominated the whole Mediterranean world. Systematically, step by step, the Romans had conquered one land after another. Rome now decided the fate of nations, including that of Cleopatra and her empire. Roman senators would decide Egypt's future. It was they who weighed the pros and cons of Rome's foreign policy. All the lands surrounding the Mediterranean had already been declared Roman provinces, all except one. By Rome's grace, Egypt alone was permitted to remain a sovereign state. But the breadbasket of Egypt was no longer safe. The rich harvest from the Nile was too important. The colossus of the era was Julius Caesar. He reached for Egypt, yet he hesitated to annex the country outright. Was it out of respect for his ancient civilization? Caesar was a man of power who tried to consolidate all the power of the state in his own person. He may have secretly dreamt of ruling like a pharaoh, and ancient Egypt in all its splendor embodied this deepest wish. A yearning that could be fulfilled by Egypt and its monarch. Cleopatra received Caesar with all the pomp of the Orient. A dream journey on the royal barge, upriver into the heartland of her empire. Was Cleopatra trying to spin a web around the Roman soldier to charm him, lure him into her own world and thus defeat him? Was she planning to save the sovereignty of her empire this way? And Caesar, was he a willing victim of this unusual foreign policy? Caesar was certainly fascinated by Egypt's tradition. The aura of 3,000 years meant much more than gold and silver. Cleopatra offered the promise of an ancient empire whose great achievements outshone the glory of Rome.
Sie hatte im Grunde genommen keine Macht anzubieten. Sie konnte sich anbieten, sie konnte das Land anbieten, was das Land hatte. Sie konnte die Geografie anbieten, die für die Römer wichtig war. Denn Ägypten als solches war für die Römer mehr eine Schatzkammer, die man ausbeuten wollte und die man auch voll unter die eigene Kontrolle bekommen wollte.
Playing politics with every means at her disposal, Cleopatra took matters to their logical conclusion. The fruit of her pleasure cruise with the world's most powerful man appears on the rear wall of her temple. Next to Cleopatra herself, the relief shows little Caesarion, her son with Caesar, and in the eyes of her subjects, a bastard. Cleopatra was playing with fire. She had broken with ancient tradition, and whoever did that endangered the Egyptian empire. Only one pharaoh before her had dared to flout tradition's iron law. Akhenaten, and he paid dearly for it. Born around 1380 BC, he founded a magnificent new capital, Akhetaten. He built it in the middle of the desert in just a few years for the sole purpose of honoring a new god named Aton. 50,000 people lived here. Their task was to worship the new god Aton, who embodied the light of the sun. A revolutionary development in a country that had always been so committed to its traditions. This bust of the queen consort Nefertiti has survived to this day. And does it not still make every claim to divine perfection? The brave new world of Akhenaten and Nefertiti broke with every ancient tradition. Inside the pharaoh's palace, the new world was taking shape in the bright, colorful decoration of the rooms. And a naturalistic representation of the human body with well-fed bellies and expressive features. Another striking feature, the head of every member of the royal family is strangely shaped, the result of a pathological deformation of the back of the skull. Modern medicine knows of a disease that could have caused the deformation. Scaphocephaly, or craniostosis, is a hereditary genetic disease that still occurs today and may have afflicted the pharaoh's entire family. Genetic technology cannot prove conclusively whether Akhenaton actually had this disease, but if he did, scaphocephaly generally does not affect either the ability to think or one's intellectual capacity.
Wir haben aus der Sicht der Archäologie, auch aus der Sicht der Philologie, also auf der Grundlage der Auswertung von Texten, keine Hinweise darauf, dass der König krank gewesen ist. Ganz im Gegenteil, der König hat bewusst versucht, seine revolutionäre Religion in neue, bislang nicht gesehene Bilder zu packen.
Akhenaton was a visionary, possibly a dreamer, but definitely not deranged. Rather, he was a power politician. He knew what he was doing when he had the statues of the ancient gods pulled down in order to enthrone his new god. Destroying the old was his political program, and it made sense, because by overthrowing the ancient religion, he was also able to destroy the ever-growing influence of the priests. His was a root and branch revolution. Even the names of the old gods were erased.
Closing all of these temples meant throwing the country into economic chaos and interfering with the standard structure of Egyptian bureaucratic administration. When, after Akhenaton's death, later generations sought to obliterate any memory of that heretic king, they did so not because of the theological problems that he had raised, but because of the economic and political chaos that the closure of the temples had caused.
With his invention of a new god, Akhenaton brought about a complete overhaul of the value system. A shock for many of his subjects, and his revolution had a built-in weakness.
He made the Egyptian to worship Aton through him only. There is no direct relation between the people and Aton. And that's why when Akhenaton died, the religious completely vanished.
The ostracized pharaoh became a great mystery for archaeologists. For years they have searched for the lost mummies of the heretic king and Nefertiti, so far without success. The royal couple attempted something that no one else in Egypt had ever dared to do, to abolish the old order, and they had to pay for it. It appears that the ancient Egyptians attempted to obliterate their names and their memory. All the wrath of a disoriented society was vented. Akhenaton became a victim of his own iconoclasm. The new ruler, Tutankhamun, quickly returned to the almost lost world of the ancient gods. Tutankhamun reopened the time-honored temple of Amun, the imperial god at Karnak, and he gave the priests back their ancestral rights.
Egyptian temples, various times, became the most powerful and richest institutions in the country. The temples at times in Egyptian history controlled probably 85% of all of the economic wealth of this land. They were an extremely important economic force. And as time went on, the priests obviously accrued to themselves more and more of this economic power, and later on, more and more political power.
Religion came to dominate every aspect of social life. Egypt became a state controlled by priests. Religion soon became a significant factor in the economy, while the high priest made a bid for the highest office in the land.
Die Schwäche des Königtums öffnet anderen gesellschaftlichen Gruppierungen, zum Beispiel den Priestern in den großen Tempeln, neue Möglichkeiten ihrer Machtentfaltung. Sie stellen sich mehr und mehr an die Stelle der Könige und übernehmen zum Beispiel Königsstatuen früherer Herrscher, versehen sie mit ihren eigenen Namen und gebärden sich auf diese Weise, als ob sie selbst Könige wären.
At first, the king's loss of power was barely noticeable. In the beginning, the high priest was only in charge of the daily rites of sacrifice in the temple sanctuary. He performed them as the pharaoh's representative. The gradual rise of Amun as the supreme imperial deity strengthened his home temple at Karnak and the influence of its priests. Henceforth, every pharaoh strove to demonstrate his devotion to the god by donating chapels and statues. The ancient reliefs tell the story. Soon, nothing in the country would work without Amun and his high priests. The power of the priests grew. The cult of Amun took center stage in Egypt. Every ruler tried to win over the gods through magnificent buildings and gifts, so they might count on their goodwill after death, when the goal was eternal life. For this, no effort was too costly. When a king died, a splendid procession went from the Nile into the remote Valley of the Kings on the edge of the desert. From this secluded valley, the deceased was to travel safely into the hereafter. Awaiting him there was Osiris, king and judge in the realm of the dead. The burial chambers were driven deep into solid rock. Some of their access shafts go down more than 100 meters. The tomb of Senenmut illustrates the importance placed on the cult of the dead. The priest is celebrating one last ritual before the tomb is sealed. In the guise of Anubis, god of the dead, he symbolically opens the mouth of the corpse to allow the mummy to breathe in order to live like the gods. All around are the treasures that will allow the ruler to lead a life befitting his status in the hereafter. They are now among the greatest treasures in modern museums. The yearning for immortality. Was this the political instrument the pharaohs used to hold their vast empire together? For several centuries it certainly was. But there was also a drawback. The priests became increasingly powerful. They became competitors of the pharaohs. The political lever the priests used so effectively was the cult of the dead. It was at the center of Egyptian life. Embalming the deceased became the most important social task. Egypt became a theocracy, and the administrators of the cult of the dead held the key positions.
It was certainly a manifestation of a deeply held belief that was shared by all classes of ancient Egyptian, whether you were a pharaoh or a peasant.
There were very precise rules and recipes for mummification, which must have been the highest goal of every Egyptian's life. The preservation of the body was the sole guarantee that life would continue in the hereafter. The eternal yearning for immortality. Cleopatra, the last pharaoh, brought this age-old hope with her to Rome, the political center of the known world. Cleopatra had to come to Rome in order to preserve her own power and to gain influence over the most powerful man in town, Julius Caesar. Cleopatra staged her visit like a fairy tale from the Arabian Nights. She lived in Rome for 2 years, close to Caesar, the father of her child. Was she planning to take control, first of Caesar, then of the entire Roman Empire? For many Romans, the thought of that was a nightmare. Cleopatra presented herself with supreme self-confidence. In the Forum, her arrival was the talk of the town and would remain so for years. The Queen of the Nile might alarm the Romans, but she also fascinated them. And it is said that as the ultimate provocation, Caesar placed a statue whose features clearly resembled those of Cleopatra in the temple of Venus Genetrix. Was the queen goddess from the Nile now to be a goddess for the Romans?
Ob es eine Statue der Kleopatra in einem römischen Tempel gegeben hat, ist durchaus zweifelhaft. Wenn eine Venus Genetrix aufgestellt wird, dann ist das durchaus verständlich aus der Situation Cäsars. Aber ob die Züge der Kleopatra getragen hat oder nicht, das ist eine Interpretationsgeschichte. Und ich glaube, das Ganze ist eine Propagandalüge der Cäsargegner.
The situation in Rome was electric. The tension was released in a sudden, unexpected and bloody incident. March the 15th, 44 BC. Caesar enters the Senate. The embrace is deceptive. His assassination is imminent. For the conspirators, Caesar was too powerful, too ambitious, too extravagant. Enough was enough. Republicans did not want a king, especially not one who had taken up with an Oriental queen.
Cäsars Tod bedeutet für Kleopatra ihr Ende im Westen, ihr Ende in Italien. Bei Nacht und Nebel ist sie auf die Schiffe gegangen und nach Hause gefahren. Und sie konnte sich dann natürlich nicht mehr halten, weil sie genau wusste, dass sie einen sehr zweifelhaften Ruf genoss in der römischen Oberschicht und ohne die Protektion Cäsars keine Chance in Italien hatte.
Cleopatra went home by sea. It was a humiliating farewell, almost a desperate flight. Overnight, all her dreams had died. Alexandria was still a safe haven for the time being. But how long would the ancient gods be able to protect the empire? Wouldn't the Romans try to grab the treasures of Egypt once again? Wouldn't the new man in Rome want to seize everything that had been built in the last 3,000 years? Cleopatra had no illusions. She knew she was playing for high stakes. Business as usual. Cleopatra repeated her power play with the new strongman of Rome, Mark Antony. She now tried to spin her web around him. Legend has it that to demonstrate her immeasurable wealth, she dissolved her most beautiful pearl in a cup of wine.
Kleopatra hat ihn ja nach allen Regeln der Kunst verführt. Und alle Leute, die sie einlädt, die bekommen ihre goldenen Messern und Gabeln und Bestecke als Geschenk mit nach Hause. Und hat also aus vollen Händen ihren Reichtum da spielen lassen. Und da war der Mark Anton, der also aus einfachen Verhältnissen in Rom kam, natürlich überwältigt.
But luxury was not all Egypt had to offer. It also promised the new ruler of the Roman Empire insights into all the secrets of the past. Antony was enchanted even more than Caesar by the magic of a tradition that dated back to time immemorial. Not that he would have understood the meaning of Egypt's enigmatic gods, but their spell must have clouded his otherwise sharp eyes. The Queen of Egypt was playing a risky game in order to bring the most powerful man of her time to heel. But even if she succeeded, would Egypt, would her people play along? A collection of papyri in Berlin contains a 2,000-year-old document signed by Cleopatra herself. Documents like these can demonstrate how far removed the Greek Macedonian dynasty in Egypt had become from its own people.
Der Verpächter dieses Stück Landes nennt sich Makedone. Wir sehen also in diesem Punkt, dass die Leute griechischer, makedonischer Abstammung eine gewisse Oberschicht bilden und die zentralen Stellen in der Verwaltung des Heeres innehaben.
In the eyes of most Egyptians, Cleopatra too was an unloved stranger, whose ancestors were conquerors from Macedonia. It was therefore all the more important for her to preserve ancient tradition and to worship the old Egyptian gods.
When foreigners came into Egypt, they did not seek to impose their culture on the Egyptians. Quite the reverse. They sought almost immediately to adopt Egyptian culture for their own needs. They knew that Egypt had been around longer than any other culture. They knew it had been here for 2,500 years, and it probably would have seemed silly to change something that obviously had worked so well for so long.
One of the permanent duties of all pharaohs was to build and maintain the countless temples. And to establish his credibility, each king had to demonstrate his military skills to the people, even if some of the enemies they allegedly defeated had never existed in the first place. His subjects believed the propaganda. The memorial to Pharaoh Thutmose describes countless victories that the glorious general supposedly won on behalf of the empire on the Nile.
Propaganda was very important. They had to do it. Because look, the king cannot be a god without smiting the enemies of Egypt. But what's happened if the king was defeated?
The temple inscription calls him the favorite of the gods, Ramses II. He became ruler of Egypt in 1279 BC. Well over 1,000 years before Cleopatra was born, he had a political education in war and peace. Of course, the world of Ramses was completely different from that into which Cleopatra was born, and also from that of his ancestors, the great pharaohs. The capital from which he ruled was no longer Thebes or Memphis, it was Ramessa. German archaeologists are conducting tests on the grounds of the ancient royal city. Dr. Helmut Becker uses a cesium magnetometer to produce something like an underground X-ray. Without any digging, Dr. Becker can visualize the foundations of the ancient capital to a depth of 5 meters. Of special interest are the fortifications of a vast army base. What was the purpose of this immense military effort? Years before Ramses ascended the throne, Egypt's geopolitical situation had begun to deteriorate. The Nubians and Libyans were becoming serious adversaries, so Egypt was no longer isolated and shielded by the sea and the desert. In the east, a strong Assyrian empire had risen, whose military arm, like that of the Hittites, was reaching out for Egypt. In addition, seafaring nations were threatening the trade routes across the Mediterranean. Egypt's position had become precarious. This made a proper defense strategy even more important. In Ramessa, the hub of Ramses' rule, archaeologists have discovered the quarters of the pharaoh's elite troops. Some of their finds are spectacular.
Wir können über die Ausgrabungen in Verbindung mit diesen Objekten nicht nur die Funktion der Gebäude feststellen, sondern auch die Anzahl der Pferde, die zum Beispiel in den Stallungen gestanden haben. Mindestens 480 Pferde haben dort gestanden, also für 240 Streitwagen.
Egypt had joined an international arms race. Technical innovations were revolutionizing traditional warfare. The introduction of the war chariot increased the pace of operations and allowed troops to cover vast distances quickly. With this technology, young Ramses felt confident to launch offensives against the Hittites. He knew that a war would concentrate all the energies of the nation, and his people longed for national unity. Setting out from his base in Pir-Ramessa, Ramses split his army near Gaza in order to guarantee supplies in this barren land. That proved a tactical error. Even before the columns were reunited, a battle broke out near Kadesh. The Hittites had deployed near the Kadesh fortress. Ramses' general staff advanced without cover. The bulk of his troops were supposed to follow later, an error the Hittites quickly exploited. After wiping out the leaderless part of the army, they attacked Ramses himself. For the king, the struggle was almost hopeless. All that saved him was the last-minute arrival of his second column. His troops just managed to bail their pharaoh out.
Für Ramses II. Muss es in seiner Jugend eine ganz tiefe traumatische Erfahrung gewesen sein, in der Schlacht von Kadesh nahezu eine Niederlage erlitten zu haben. Die Einsicht in die Unmöglichkeit einer militärpolitischen Lösung aller Probleme seiner Zeit hat Ramses II. Dazu geführt, den langen Weg zum Frieden zu beschreiten.
The long road to peace, and the old wisdom that Egypt would profit more from peace than from war. At his Pir-Ramessa excavation site, German archaeologist Dr. Edgar Pusch has found evidence that the young pharaoh learned his lesson.
Nach der Schlacht bei Kadesh im 5. Regierungsjahr Ramses II. Wurde zwischen ihm und Hattusili III. Ein Friedensvertrag geschlossen in seinem 21. Regierungsjahr. Wechselseitiger Nichtangriffspakt, wechselseitiger Beistandspakt. Ramses II. Und Hattusili III. Standen jedenfalls in bester Beziehung zueinander. Und der endgültige Schluss und Friedensschluss wurde dann vollzogen durch die diplomatische Heirat zwischen der ältesten Tochter Hattusili III. Und Ramses II.
The peace treaty was worth more to the unity of the country than all the war chariots and military efforts put together. Did Cleopatra remember this 1,200 years later? She too wanted to preserve the empire through peaceful means. Her politics of seduction tamed Mark Antony and saved Egypt's sovereignty. But there was one thing they both forgot. Octavian, the new hope of the Romans. Octavian increasingly mistrusted Mark Antony and his Oriental passion. Orient versus Occident, a smouldering conflict that would turn into a political conflagration. The showdown took place halfway between the two powers, in Greek waters off the coast of Actium. In the north was Octavian, seeking a quick decision. In the south were Mark Antony's forces, vastly superior, but not wisely positioned. Little has changed to this day. Mark Antony had 100,000 of his legionaries rest on this swampy riverbank, a breeding ground for mosquitoes and malaria. With 500 ships, 60 of them under the personal command of Cleopatra, Mark Antony thought himself invincible in the Gulf of Actium. In hindsight, this was a fatal misjudgment. Does any trace of the giant battle remain in the Azure Sea? Currents and mud have long erased all sign of it. But this is the exact location where hundreds of warships sank on September the 2nd, 31 BC. Mark Antony had military superiority, but his stars were unlucky. Only about 200 of his warships were able to sail, for half his sailors were sick. This animation reconstructs the course of the battle. On the far left is Octavian's blockade. Mark Antony's fleet advances to engage it. Cleopatra holds her ships back. Why? To this day, no explanation has been found for that or for what followed. Cleopatra flees without a fight. Then Antony makes the fiasco complete. Blinded by love, he follows his Egyptian goddess.
In dem Augenblick, wo der Feldherr versagt, dann nützt die ganze Tapferkeit der Soldaten nichts mehr. Und in diesem Falle ist es tatsächlich so gewesen, dass Marcus Antonius zu früh die Waffen gestreckt hat.
Alexandria was no safe haven now. Octavian's legions would come and occupy the city. They would force their way into Cleopatra's palace and find the queen. But not Mark Antony, who had already fallen on his sword. Cleopatra was now alone. Was it the end?
Sie ist als Frau geliebt worden, man hat das genossen, was sie geboten hat, aber man hat sich doch primär als Römer gesehen, der dieses Land, das man annektiert hat, eben für sich persönlich, für seinen eigenen Vorteil ausnutzen konnte. Und dadurch hatte, meine ich, Kleopatra keine Chance.
The last queen of Egypt. What was left for her? Her third attempt to seduce a Roman general failed miserably. And now, would she be dragged through the streets of Rome as a trophy and then pine away in a Roman dungeon? Cleopatra made a different choice. She joined her ancestors. The pharaohs of the past. Rome was her undoing. Rome and its new ruler Octavian, the Emperor Augustus. The Roman Empire was happy to take Egyptian grain, but preferred to do without an Egyptian queen who meant nothing but trouble. And Augustus enjoyed being hailed as the new pharaoh himself.
Kaiser Augustus gliedert 30 vor Christus das antike Nilland dem römischen Imperium ein. Er tritt hier in diesem Relief des Kalabscha-Tores als Pharao in altägyptischer Tracht mit altägyptischen Insignien auf. Und nur die hieroglyphische Beischrift hier oben benennt ihn als Romaios Kaisaros. In ägyptischen Schriftzeichen ein griechischer Name für einen römischen Pharao.
Octavian was the new ruler of the known world, and Egypt was now part of his empire. The Romans called the new era the Golden Age. As a sign for all the world to see that Egypt was now in the possession of Rome, Octavian had the obelisk from the Sun Temple in Heliopolis brought to Rome. From then on, standing on the Field of Mars, it adorned the Roman capital as a trophy, visible from afar, and it doubled nicely as a sundial. But that wasn't all. The golden ball that once captured the rays of the Egyptian sun now shone under another sky, as if the ancient gods had transferred their blessing. Egypt, with all its splendor, had become a chapter in the history of Rome.